Hi, I'm Joellyn Rock, and I'm a professor of art and design with a focus in digital art at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And I'm one of the lead artists who created the work Fishnet Stockings. The creative team included two other visual artists, Allison Ani and her sister Kirsten Ani. It included creative code people from computer science, Pete Williamson and Logan Sales. It also included a number of artists who use their bodies in the piece that are used as silhouettes. So Rob Wittig, Kathy Podeswa, Linnea Hinkle, and a slew of other collaborative bodies. I'm drawn to creatures of hybridity, creatures that are surprising monsters in our collective stories. And so in my previous work, I've worked for many years with fairy tales and mythology. And I love being drawn to the weird, the most surreal kinds of images that I find in those worlds. And so mermaids are just perfect. They're a hybrid composite of human and sea creature. And so it's a natural fit for me. But the main reason I chose mermaids at that point to work with is that I wanted to do a piece that talked about seaports, because I was creating the work to bring it to Bergen, Norway, and I live in Duluth, Minnesota. And it was one of those links I could see between the two locations, that they are seaports, and they're old seaports in which many stories have flowed in and out of them, but fishing, myths of fishing. And here in Minnesota, we have Ojibwe tales and things that go back into sea creatures that were in Lake Superior. And in Scandinavia, we have all sorts of myths and legends, and the mermaid is one of those things that you find in European folk tales. Well, I will honestly tell you that one of my missions in life is to actually do versions of fairy tales that are oppositional to Disney. I will say that in my studies of fairy tales, what you find when you go down that rabbit hole of exploring a story, that oral tales were passed for so many years back that no one really knows where those originate. And mermaid is one of the ones that you can find popping up all over the world. So actually, one of the other reasons I was drawn to talking about mermaids at this point too was in examining those seaports, thinking about what all gets bought and sold in seaports, and the sort of the echoes of various eras in which there has been human trafficking. And we had just had some stories, news stories come up in our region in which there was evidence of human trafficking in our port. And so I was also wanting to weave in that component. So when you look at the Disney version, I'm not so sure that you'll see that in there, but if you look at Hans Christian Andersen's version, there's this notion of a woman being a female sea creature being taken into a port, ending up in a port, having to morph and adapt in somewhat violent ways to become something other than what she is in order to fit in. And so those were some of the themes that I find interesting. They're there in the Disney one, but they're very glossed over and sugar-coated. I don't think I've ever watched the Disney Little Mermaid all the way through. I'm sorry. So it's not a influence so much on this piece, other than that it's such a huge piece of popular culture that I know little girls all over the world connect to that that Little Mermaid story, but my mission as a storyteller is to get them to dive below the surface of those popularized versions and to examine them a little more. So I've been working with fairy tales and myths for 2 decades or more, really. I look for stories again. Sometimes I look for stories that I don't know that well because I want to explore them more. So in the past, I did a piece. I've done a lot of ceramic work that has silhouetted imagery of old stories on it, or I play off of them a bit. I've done a piece that was in the original ELO, the first ELO conference, about Vasilisa and Baba Yaga. So based on a Slavic myth, legend, folktale, fairy tale, however you want to characterize it. Partly why I was drawn to that one was that I love the composite of Baba Yaga and her hut that walks around on chicken legs. So these, again, this is like a hybrid image of that surreal world of story that I find, it's like scary. It gets your heart beating. It's scary and creepy, and yet it also leads you into a deeper narrative. So I worked with those fairy tales. I've worked with Bluebeard. I did giant puppet heads and stuff for a theatrical in Seattle back in that 80s, based on Bluebeard. And I've worked with Greek mythology a lot. I like to bounce off of it. So I have worked with the story of Persephone and Demeter and Hades. And I've also worked with the story of Odysseus in a few different times, but most recently in Salt Immortal Sea, which is a piece that you're aware of that is also an electronic literature piece. Yeah, I think of myself a little bit as a remix artist or someone who mashes things up, layers. So in the backgrounds of Fishnet Stockings, you will see layers of imagery from public domain, old images of sea creatures and mermaids throughout time. And sometimes I collage in maps of places, buildings. Sometimes I collage in my own photography and videos to build up that texture. And especially in Fishnet Stockings, there's this sense of a deep watery world where you want to feel that you're passing through layers of ocean depth or story depth in a sense, So I use Photoshop a lot in my 2D work. And then I also use Final Cut, which is a video editing program that allows you to put lots of layers in. So it's really a fun process for me. I joke, but it's really the truth. I like to make messes. And then I like to find what I can make clarify from that mess, if that makes sense. So I give myself permission to play with all these images and I layer them together. And sometimes they are like collage. Sometimes they're paper collage strips that I've just done physically and watercolors and things like that. And I layer them in. And then in this work of Fishnet Stockings, I invited Allison Ani and her sister Kirsten to contribute also. So Allison was a mad collage artist, and her work is embedded in lots of the layers, as well as Kirsten's pattern work with fabric and textile. In fact, that's something Allison brought to the piece that I didn't actually know. So that's like one of those things that happens when you get people to collaborate with you and then they bring new knowledge to the piece. Super exciting. So Allison is expert in Scandinavian culture and visual art, and she makes work that's very influenced by Scandinavian patterns. And so when I told her, oh, I want to do this piece about mermaids for Bergen, Norway, she said, well, it has to include the fact that Hans Christian Andersen did paper cuts. And I said, oh, he did. So I didn't know about that. And she turned me on to this whole tradition of him cutting paper cuts as he told stories. So he would fold the paper and gather children around him. And I think he did it a little bit as a parlor game or sort of a party trick, because he was not very wealthy. He was allowed to stay in wealthy people's homes as a guest. And I think he sort of did these little storytelling sessions as sort of part of having a roof over his head a bit. And so he'd sit there and he'd cut and tell the story. And then at the end, the big reveal of this like bifurcated, folded, snowflake-like thing. And he used really big scissors, like you would think he had tiny scissors, but no, he had these like big scissors. And I think it was very theatrical. And boy, I wish there was a film of him doing that. Just a little too early to have a film of that. And so silhouettes are one of the oldest forms of storytelling imagery, right? So I grew up with books by Wanda Gogg and Virginia Lee Burton and amazing illustrators, where you'd often see a little silhouette in the story in between the pages. So I feel like that is so old for me as a child, that it's almost unconscious to think in terms of silhouettes. I mean, we can go back to Plato's cave, I suppose. We can go back definitely to the imagery on Greek pottery, which is a huge influence on my ceramic work, but also an influence just in terms of boiling things down into a simple form that lacks the detail of specificity, and therefore you can project onto it whoever you want that figure to be. And so that's part of the power and the draw of silhouettes, is that they aren't specific people or creatures or whatever, but they're looming out there, and we can embed our own story onto them. And so I had been doing a lot of silhouette work on my ceramic work in the 1980s. I did shadow puppet theater pieces with poets in Seattle, and that Bluebeard piece that was shadow puppetry. So I also used to travel around to schools. I was an artist in residence in Washington State. And I'd travel around to schools, and sometimes I would do shadow puppet theater with kids in classrooms as their special artist. So a lot of years of doing that kind of shadow puppetry work, translating it back into illustration, back into ceramic work. And then there was this big break in my career where I started to do digital media. And it was just natural when I started getting back into storytelling with digital media. So the Vasilisa project with Baba Yaga and silhouettes with that. And then Sophronia, which was another silhouette piece. There's been a series. So in a way, I don't even think twice about it before I begin working in silhouettes. And then being a researcher that helped to create the Motion and Media Cross Disciplines Lab at UMD, we, in the Mad Lab, we have a green screen, and that was the perfect space to be able to create silhouettes. So it's a fun way of working. Now, in terms of contemporary art, I would say probably one of the most powerful uses of silhouettes is Kara Walker's work that really addresses issues of race. And her work's important, very, very important. And it's important for people to know it, but also to contextualize it, because she began working with silhouettes in the 90s. Around mid 90s was when her work really took off that way. I was working with silhouettes a good decade before that. So I was kind of not really that aware of her work until a little later. And the comparisons there, but there were other contemporary artists before me, like Roger Brown. I don't know if you know his work, but he was part of the Chicago School. And I think I'm more likely to have seen his work and then those children's book illustrators' work that was very influential in my aesthetic. Kara Walker's work with silhouettes definitely, addresses racial issues. I would say that mine is more feminist issues. And so a lot of, if you look at my ceramic work, a lot of it has to do with women, silhouettes of women, and women in various situations. Whatever. I think there's a way that silhouettes are precious, and I think Kara Walker plays off of this too, that there's this sort of fairy tale preciousness about them that we associate with a kind of feminine storybook, children's nursery world. And when you embed into that, as she does so well, some of the horrors of history or reality now, it makes people do a double take about the content. They're drawn to the sweetness of what they associate with silhouettes. And then they have to do a double take because they see what's really happening in the image. And that is something, it is a way of working that I've always been drawn to. And I used to say that my ceramic work were decoy pots. That's what I used to say. They're like decoy pots. I want to lure people in because they think they're seeing something pretty and sweet. And then what happens is they see, oh, there's a little subversion of this. There's a twist on this. So I think that's an important part for Kara Walker's work. I think it's important for me too, but just in really different ways. I would say that the vision of the piece was really mine. Like I had an idea of, that I wanted to work with projections. I knew there would be silhouettes because I wanted to have bodies moving in it. But in terms of collaborative teams, I wanted to do something interactive and I didn't have all the skills to pull that off. And so being in the Motion and Media Cross Disciplines Lab, first of all, Lisa Fitzpatrick, who runs that lab, is like the best matchmaker in the world. She's really good at looking at the university and not seeing silos, but breaking the silos down. She's constantly like introducing people. Oh, so-and-so across campus is doing this. So she brought together the 5 of us from different disciplines who built the lab together, who created the grant for the lab. And one of them was Pete Williamson. And Pete Williamson's an unusual computer programmer because he has that artistic openness in some ways. So he was willing to help me solve the problem of, could I create a projection work in which people's bodies would trigger, so there'd be motion activation within the piece. Not a new idea. This has been around for a long time, but I had never worked with it. So Pete was willing to explore it, and he mentored Logan Sales, who really did the bulk of the coding for it. And it was a little bit about like, well, what do you think you could figure out how we can do it? So we knew that the idea of flocking, so little creatures could be programmed to flock and respond to the body of somebody who stepped in. We knew we were going to use a Connect because that was something, an affordable motion activating system that you could hack. We knew we would use open source software processing. And so Pete and Logan sort of hammered out some things we could do with it. And Logan spent a ton of time in the lab actually sitting there doing the code, and a lot of things they don't work on the first try, right? So there's lots of hours of, well, let's, if we tweak that part. There were things I wanted to have happen that no one could figure out how to make those happen. I wanted there to be a part in the coding where you could do paper cutting. We never figured that out, so we substituted other things. So there's 3 parts in the story that each have different ways that your body can move and activate it. And that's the physical connect-based interactivity. But there's also a second way that you can interact with a piece, and that is through text. So you can write into the piece. And originally it was through Twitter. And the Twitter feed, using 3 different hashtags, could be pulled into the projections, into the same processing code that was working with the Connect. And so a lot of that got tricky because we needed to use things that could pull from the feed of Twitter off the internet, but also could respond in real time to a body who stepped into the projection space and interact. And so ultimately that became more and more problematic as the piece has aged, because you have different parts of that technology sort of not being cooperative after a while. We also found over the years that Twitter was a bit of a hostile home for our storytelling. And as we started to work with families, we switched to using a Google form so that we knew there were safe constraints if kids were going to be typing into the piece. And family members, we didn't want them coming upon all sorts of bad Twitter stuff. The female form of a mermaid, right? It's this like beautiful form. And then again, my collaborator, Allison Ani, her daughter, Linnea Hinkle, was a dancer. She was a teenage high school student, and she was super excited that we were doing this piece. And she said, you know, can I participate? And she brought along 2 friends, Mary Myers and Henriette Soderlund. And she, Henriette, has heritage from Norway too. And her mother was from Bergen, I think. And so they were all excited that we were doing this piece. And they just came over to the green screen studio to the Mad Lab and played. And so we just said, well, how would a mermaid move? And played around with types of silhouettes you could make. We were taping on crazy fake tails, you know, made out of bubble wrap. Other people came in, friends and family members came in to make kind of octopus characters. Rob Wittig was in there acting out being Hans Christian Andersen at some points with a big scissors. I'm trying to think, Kathy Podeswa is in it, I think. I'm trying to think of who else is in that. Oh, Teresa Koenig, she was one of the people that was playing in the lab that day, and her daughter, Katie. So yeah, a bunch of people are willing, as it turns out, to just be playful. And I think that's another key about the silhouette thing, frankly, is that if you tell people they're not going to be that clearly identifiable, they'll do anything with their bodies, right? If it was with bright lighting, and then you get into all the issues of, you know, costume, makeup, and all that stuff, and do I look okay? But people are very playful in the dark, right? So I think that, you know, that's one of the fun parts about it. It also just, it's partly connected to my attitude that let's play, let's make a mess, and I'll see if I can make something out of this later. Then you mentioned the dancing on at an event, and yes, in Bergen, Norway, we at the electronic literature event, that there was a live DJ there, and the 3 mermaid dancers came over to Norway for the event. Well, they came on a trip, but they coincided with our event and came and dressed in beautiful costumes created by Kirsten Ani. patterns and fins and, decorative detail. But they danced in the silhouettes there, or in amongst the silhouettes, let's say. So there's sort of this layering.
Did the piece change very much between the various installations of it?
I will say that it did a bit in that we started discovering the text as the text was flowing through, that we wanted it to be bigger or to separate out or to shift in different ways so that the way we timed it was that the text would come through once across the top. And then we programmed it so that it would keep coming back through, but it would get a little bit lighter in opacity or whatever, and that it would get bigger as if it was kind of warping into the water. And so it's pretty clear and you can read it when it first comes across, and then it will circle back through, but other text is starting to come in too. It gets pretty complex to read, I guess, but if you hang in, if you sit in the gallery space and watch it come through, you can start following it and detect these patterns.
That's great. Is there anything else you wanted to say about the piece?
Well, I will say there's a lot of music in it too, and that that I was very grateful that Bob Duskus at 6 Degrees Records basically helped identify some of the music from his collection of electronica, and so some of those, and a lot of that is listed on the Fishnet Stockings website, so you can see the full credits. But the Bombay Dub Orchestra and the Medieval Pundits and some other of the 6 Degrees musicians were generous enough to just let us use their music. And then my son, JJ Sivak, composed one of the songs for the first part. And Tobin Dack, who's a local Duluth electronica guy, he did the music track that's used in the 3rd section of Fishnet Stockings, the part that's the bad bargains and exchanges. And I love that. And he added in like sound effects of money. You can hear like money and things. I don't know. He just did a great job with that, and it really conveys the mood. So there's 3 sections of the story. There's the innocence section at the beginning, and that music is really beautiful and kind of floaty. Then there's the shipwreck section, and that music is kind of almost reggae-like, but there's some dynamics that are kind of more crashing sounds. And then the final one with Bad Bargains has this sort of sense that you're in like a marketplace and there's exchanges taking place. And that's the part that I had hoped that people would be kind of inspired by writing new endings. So instead of the Little Mermaid having to have her tail cut off and float up into the heavens and die, or whatever she does, in all the versions, it's sort of brutal. What would happen if she made a better bargain and she got herself out of that situation. So another way that I think about this piece is I think about it as an illuminated manuscript where I've created the visuals and I'm inviting you to write into it.